This may be our final segment on hunger. I'm not quite sure. I want to investigate a little more if there's anything left unsaid. But this truly is, I think, kind of the period at the end of the sentence for what we've been studying. So just as a very, very quick review, the first time we took a swing at this, we talked about blood sugar levels because that's a big theory in hunger. If blood sugar is unstable, that creates, different forms of hunger, different perceptions of hunger. And I think through the study we looked at, that bore out to be true. If you remember the two big ways of categorizing hunger, when your stomach goes through its final contractions, when you finish digesting as much food as needs to be digested, it's not just this little kind of trickle that finally finishes through the pyloric sphincter into the small intestine, but there are some massively strong contractions that drive the rest of those contents out of the stomach, very similar to when you vomit. And the top end is also, let me see. Make sure, hang on a second, guys. Got to mute somebody. So, if your emetic center in your brain is triggered and you have a vomiting reflex, the cardiac sphincter in your upper stomach, between your stomach and esophagus, will open up. And you know how violent that is, right? Like that's just, you can't control that vomiting. It's just unbelievably strong and forceful. Well, that exact same thing is happening to empty your stomach contents when you are completely finished with digestion. And so that gives you that first wave of hunger, or at least a sensation of being mechanically empty. And that's a significant point in the literature regarding hunger, because at that point, a lot of people go eat. You just literally emptied your stomach contents. Your blood sugar is still high and increasing because your small intestine is still doing its thing. The stomach contents were just completely eliminated. And yet we're then pouring food on top of food, which can, create a positive energy balance. So that's the first place to recognize, almost through a biofeedback mechanism, that, yes, my stomach's empty, but I really don't feel hungry. I don't feel hypoglycemic, don't feel weak by any stretch. But then to be very, very in tune with those changes in blood sugar, that first study we looked at did describe how with training, even children were better than adults at recognizing true blood sugar levels with great accuracy, and could then objectively name that hunger, be more cognitive of it, and manage it better. And so again, with 90% accuracy, even children were able to say, yeah, I kind of felt like I was hungry, but then I thought through the process. I kind of internally connected with what I think my internal blood sugar levels are, that interoceptive awareness, and I'm not hungry. I guess I decided I'm not hungry. You can make that decision with some internal awareness and some logic, and that's a big part of it. So the second study we looked at just last week was more of a hormonal part of hunger. And there were some conclusions made that I'm going to revisit today. I may kind of hold off on those, because these 2 weeks, last week and this week, go hand in hand. They looked at some of the same things, but just a little bit differently. One thing I'll mention, our conclusion last time was that it was really more important to consider fullness, that very first wave of hunger, to decide how full am I actually from this meal. It's almost that push away from the table effect. People who could monitor that and control that had a much better success rate at keeping weight off. In the study we looked at last week, they went through a retrospective analysis of the year. They had their intervention. Then at the end of the year, they noted that a substantial amount of those subjects had regained a decent amount of weight back. And that's part of the contrast I'm going to spend talking about this week, because those subjects did not note much hunger. throughout the entire year with that retrospective analysis, they said, yeah, I don't know why I gained that weight back. I can't really say I was hungry. I've even had clients tell me that, guys. I've had clients say, yeah, I'm 50 pounds, 75 pounds, 100 pounds overweight. And I don't even know what it's like to be hungry because I never let myself get hungry. I just keep eating. And the same thing happened with these subjects through weight regain. They did not correlate their regain back to hunger at all, yet they regained weight. So this week, they conducted a study. The study I'm going to look at looked at it a different way. They kept people on a controlled diet for a full year. And then they did some analysis that I think is different, and they had some different conclusions, but kind of parallel. So let's dive in. Investigation of the long-term sustainability of changes in appetite after weight loss. Pretty recent study, Journal of Obesity, was also published in Nature, which is one of the biggest science journals. So pretty serious study. This is not something, too peripheral that I just conjured up to look at. This is a major seminal study. They did cite a lot of the dominant literature when it comes to some of the hormonal changes and different theories in appetite and weight regain. But let me read this real quick, so you know kind of what their objective was. Diet-induced weight loss leads to a compensatory increase in appetite and changes in the plasma concentration of appetite-regulating hormones. Whether these changes are transient or sustained remains unclear. This study aimed to assess if changes in the subjective and objective appetite markers observed with weight loss are sustained after 1 year. So similar to last week, they were doing survey analysis. They were asking a lot of questions, but they were also taking blood marker checks, baseline of things like ghrelin, glucagon-like peptide, even insulin this time. I said last week, I wasn't sure why they didn't check that, maybe because it's such a perfectly opposite correlate to glucagon. But, same thing with the peptide YY and the CCK, the longer, parts of hormonal regulation through the large intestine and the distal small intestine. But again, they wanted to subjectively analyze people's perception of hunger, this time, though, with a very controlled diet. And as they said here, this is what's interesting, I think, to bring up to you guys as clients and coaches. In the research, people who do metabolic science research for a living, they understand that it's a given that there always seems to be, as said here, a compensatory increase in appetite after weight loss. So it seems to be a mystery to a lot of people. Why is recidivism in weight loss so high? Why do fewer than about 10% of people ever achieve sustained weight loss? And I think for those of us who have done macronutrient-based tracking and coaching, those of us who have combined that with a really long-term intervention approach with a lot of support and coaching, deep coaching relationships. And especially, I see a couple of people on this call who have lost a substantial amount of weight and kept it off. Whenever you see those dire statistics that so few people keep it off, I almost wonder, like, if that is going to turn, if the kind of intervention we see with more of an education-based nutrition, which is truly just becoming mainstream. You guys connected to us and in the weight loss industry that's tied heavily to physique and performance sport. You guys have known about, and you guys have been tracking macros and looking at nutrition objectively for years. The mainstream population is just getting there. And I truly think we're going to see that that's probably one of the things that stems the tide of obesity, because there is just that anchoring to the most objective way you can think about and consider your own nutrition. And that's just the doorway. We did a nutrition coaching global mastermind this month. Brian St. Pierre, Precision Nutrition, Dr. Souders, and I. And that's one of the things we talked about. Everybody agreed, even Brian, who, as a registered dietitian and the nutrition director for Precision Nutrition, They like a kid's glove approach to this kind of stuff. They don't push like everybody must track macros. Everybody must have this hyper objective methodology. Quite the opposite. But he freely admitted, without any questioning or pressure from me, that yeah, macro tracking at some point that probably has to be done. You may not start with that. He even said, my 75-year-old grandmother may never do that, but you can even use proxies for it. And that's where you'll do things like a serving size is like your palm for protein, maybe your fist for carbohydrates. But he said at some level, there has to be objectivity there. So I like the fact that this study used that for an entire year. And they did it in a couple of different ways. They even, through their maintenance phase, once they got past the 12-week intervention, they even had people wear things like Fitbits and other wearables and devices to measure their calorie output, because they wanted everything accounted for and correlated with the study. They didn't want to have any outlier variables that could have changed their analysis. So I think it was really, really good, super objective, and I'll show you what they were looking at here. So 100 subjects, 45 men, 55 women. They ended up, I think, with about 94. A few people washed out. They just couldn't take the intervention part. The BMI was 37 plus or minus 4 kilograms per meter squared. That's how BMI is conducted. So a BMI of 37, as I said last week, is pretty high. 40 crosses the line from obese to morbidly obese. So men and women at this level are probably 60 to 80 pounds overweight. Average age 43, plus or minus 10 years. The actual intervention was 8 weeks on a very low calorie diet. And there are some different ways to define that, but for their purposes, it was 550 calories for women, 660 for men. That's, I see Stacy's eyes growing this big. That's what medically is considered a very low calorie diet. That's, I've always heard 500 calories. If you go to the Mayo Clinic, for kind of an emergency type surgery, exploratory surgery, and you need a weight loss to make that surgery more successful or safer, immediately 500 calorie diet. Typically also with food, which they used here, they used diet type products. So this intervention was, again, more objective. Here's the food and the supplements you're going to consume. This is how you're going to get your calories for 8 weeks. And then they did, oh, by the way, and then you can see the macro breakdown, pretty standard dietetic, lower fats, moderate carbs, pretty solid protein level. But again, on a very low calorie diet, they're probably still using the RDA of protein. So that would be a higher percentage because it's a lower calorie platform. Then they did a 4-week incremental increase of calories to get them back up to maintenance. And of course, they were measuring RMR through gas, expiration and so forth. And so with metabolic cart testing, they noted, oh, by the way, this is what was interesting. So we talked about this a little bit last week and maybe even the week prior, but with men and women combined, but you will see here the plus or minus 400 calories, just their RMR after dieting was about 1,600, almost 1,700 calories. So resting metabolic rate. And then after, let me back this up. Once they brought them up after the 8-week intervention to kind of a maintenance level, they calculated it at 1,690 calories. Then once they got to the 12-week mark and they considered, okay, any kind of metabolic recovery has taken place, now we're going to baseline you out for the rest of the year. Then the RMR was almost 2,100 calories, but plus or minus 520. So they're not differentiating men versus women in that particular stat. So as I've always contended, the best research shows that the average basal metabolic rate for women is about 1,350 calories. Average for men is about 1,650. But they calculated, much higher here. These particular people, their metabolic rates recovered, I would say, pretty nicely, because for an average of 2,100 calories, including, and that's not just RMR, but that includes what would be their functional metabolic rate. That ended up being a pretty solid number. Then they also use these fasting and post-eating surveys of hunger, fullness, desire to eat, and what's called prospective food consumption. Plasma levels, again, of ghrelin, the peptide YY, glucagon-like peptide 1, cholecystokinin, and insulin, all measured at the very beginning, plus at that 13-week transition mark, and then at 1 year. So they're getting a lot of survey material we'll go over. And then they're also going through, the actual blood markers here. I'm going to answer Stacey's question here. Does the low calories 8 weeks diet create lower levels of hunger? That's what the study is all about. We'll find out. That's what they wanted to measure. So let me continue on with the actual now results. Let me see here. So after their intervention, after 8 weeks, they lost 16% of their body weight, which correlated to, let me see here. I put minus, so it's minus 18 kilograms plus or minus, so almost 40 pounds. So in 8 weeks on a very low calorie diet, they lost that much, which you would consider pretty normal for that level of calorie intake. They did note significant fasting hunger. And remember, as I talked about from our study last week, and even the week before, looking at blood sugar, we look at hunger post-meal, exactly right after eating, that transitional point where the stomach's empty, but blood sugar and, blood lipids are higher. And then also fasting. So now we know after the dust has settled, after, blood sugar has kind of gone up postprandial, post-meal, and then is coming back down, then how do you feel after 3, 4, 5, 6 hours or so, of fasting? So once they had gone through the 8 weeks of not fasting, but the very low calorie diet, and they had continued on for that 4 weeks of just baselining back up to maintenance, there were still reports of 38% increases in hunger. And even at the end of 1 year, a 22% increase in reports of hunger. Now, remember, they put these people on a particular intervention for the 8 weeks, for the transition to maintenance, and then for the full year. So this particular study showed, even at the end of a year, these subjects were dealing with some hunger. Last week, when they were allowed to eat ad libitum, they could just eat whatever they want, even though they gave them support. They said, if you guys want support, you can come talk to us. The recidivism wasn't that high, but still, I believe it was like about a third. I think people had lost about 38 or so pounds as well in that intervention. And then they had gained back about 13 to 14 on average. So they had not gained it all back, but they gained some, which again, just statistically as an average, that means that there was a calorie surplus over that year, even if slight, there was a calorie surplus. And so those people said, I didn't feel hungry. If I gained any weight back, it sure wasn't because I was hungry. Even people who might have maintained, they said, we're doing fine. These people, their goal was to stay on a pretty steady diet, and they still reported a decent amount of hunger toward the end, though it did decrease. I mean, almost by half, from 38% to 22%. Here's an interesting little correlate to that. They actually reported increased postprandial fullness after the intervention. So I think that'll make sense to you that, you know how everybody says when you go on a diet, your quote stomach shrinks. It's not so much, although it may, that the actual organ gets a little tighter. I mean, if you've ever seen a stomach, it's just a very thickly walled, muscle and so forth. So I don't think necessarily your stomach shrinks. I think you just get used to a certain level of those baroreceptors and how much expansion there is when you're full and distended versus not. Your tolerance and your perception of that changes. but your stomach is not this thing that gets like super, super small and tight and then expands, like a balloon. It's a very, very muscular organ. But again, that perception of fullness really increased 10% at week 13, and then still up 6% by the end of the year. Here's what that means in real life. I was just telling a client of mine that this week. For my competitive career as a bodybuilder, I spent almost 20 years either dieting for a contest or eating up into an off season, dieting for a contest, eating up and maintaining. I mean, it was my job to gain and lose weight for almost 20 years. When I retired, I spent 10 years just right at my metabolic set point. I stayed at about 155 pounds for a decade. And, here I am about 5 or 6 years after that. When I was competing and in off seasons, when I could eat what I want, it was nothing for me to eat 6, 8, 10 slices of pizza. If it's like a Domino's pizza, that's just what it took to even feel like I was full. Now, after 15 years of not gaining weight like that, like after a weight loss and then regain, now I'll have one slice of pizza and I'll typically be considering, am I full or do I want a second slice? And, most times I'll have a second, but I can't eat more than that. And that's what that postprandial food consumption or perspective of that food consumption is. How full do I feel? How much food do I think I need to eat at this meal? So these people in this study, after 13 weeks and a year, they reported hunger was higher. And yet my sense of fullness is also higher. Like I don't feel like I can eat that much. That's an interesting little teeter-totter correlation. Now, some of the things that we talked about last week, all of the blood products, all the hormones were almost identical. You see increases in things like ghrelin, which is the hunger hormone. So because your body is in a calorie deficit or in a calorie maintenance position, to be in a calorie maintenance position means that you do have calorie positive times because you're eating a meal. But then to be in a neutral position, that means you're in a calorie negative position at some points of the day. Now, remember what it's like for those of you who are in a state of perpetual weight gain. If I had just finished a bodybuilding contest prep phase, and now I'm going to go through the next 4 or 5 months in a calorie surplus to eat back up to a level, that I want, whether it's moderate or not, that's almost a constant calorie surplus. But if I'm eating at maintenance, that means meals are high. In between meals, there has to be some kind of a lowness. And so this is going to come back up later as we look at the discussion and the conclusions. But I'm not going to get too much into the hormone levels because that's what last week was all about. You can go back and review that one if you want. Things were almost identical here. But here's what was interesting. These people who had lost 16% of their body weight at the end of that year, they had maintained 15%. So they had initially lost 18 kilograms. By the end of a full year, they were still down 16. That's success. I mean, that's big time success. Plus or minus a kilogram, you've gone for a full year after losing almost 40 pounds and you've kept off 38. You get a blue ribbon from me. But this is that interesting little teeter-totter that I mentioned. If the drive to eat more in the fasting state, because that's when you're in that calorie deficit, if you're eating for maintenance, after meals, you should feel good if you can make it past that initial gastric emptying. If you make it past that first wave of hunger pang, and you did not, succumb to that, but you allowed yourself to use your blood sugar products and blood lipids and so forth, then at some point in not the postprandial or post-feeding time, but in the fasting time, that's when they would actually say they were hungrier. Completely opposite from last week's study. Last week's study, they concluded it was all about controlling that post-meal food intake. It was about the push away from the table reflex. If we can just get people to stop eating when they're full, then the game is won. These people, these subjects, because they were on a controlled diet, they had no choice. They were, they only got so much food per meal. And then, they just reported, in between meals, their hunger was actually increased up to 22% by the end of the year. Then they had recalled it retrospectively, prior to this intervention. So I hope you guys are kind of seeing some things come together here. Because ghrelin, the hunger hormone, was still substantially increased at week 13. Of course, when you're on a very low calorie diet, you're going to see those hormones. Insulin's going to be way, way down because you don't have all that food stimulating a storage response. And insulin stayed down by up to 50%. Those ishes, 50-ish and 30-ish, those are my, that's not their technical, I was grabbing this from their tables, but it was substantial. Like when you would see something like insulin levels at let's say, 1,000, even a year later, the average, almost like checking your A1C, was down to 400 or 500. But that's a good thing. We correlate increased insulin to satiety, because if you got high insulin levels, that means you're eating a lot of food. And so to have more stable, regulated insulin levels is a good thing. Yet that also means you're probably going to feel some extra hunger because you're simply allowing blood clearing. You guys may see in the supplement marketing, everybody's selling now at glucose disposal agents. And these are, some vitamin Bs and some chromium and some things like that are supposed to help with blood sugar regulation and hunger. Some of them work. I've taken some, and sometimes I feel like somebody really hit a home run with whatever they have in there. Not well regulated, of course, but glucose disposal, lipid disposal through the bloodstream, that's what we want. We actually want to feel empty. We want our blood sugar levels and blood lipid levels to be lower, because that's the state at which we will start harvesting body fat as energy. So as we talked about last week as well, the longer, acting down the chain in the GI system, peptides, the P or the peptide YY and the CCK, those were still reduced at 13 weeks, but then they were back up at a year. So kind of with maintenance, those came back up. Those are more the chronic look at overall hunger and blood sugar and blood product management there. But the acute ones, things like insulin, glucagon-like peptide, ghrelin, even leptin, which wasn't really looked at this week, but it was last week. What I want you guys probably already read this, but no significant correlation, direct quote from the study, no significant correlation was found between changes in subjective appetite feelings and changes in the plasma concentrations of appetite-related hormones at any time, week 13 or 1 year. What that means is when food went down, ghrelin went up, insulin went down. And then when we brought food back up to maintenance levels, insulin went up a little bit, ghrelin went down a little bit, but it was correlated perfectly with what you would think. It was the food intake level. And then with maintenance, because these subjects had a high BMI to start, 37, now they'd lost 40 pounds and were maintaining that. You still saw insulin down and ghrelin up a little bit, but their hunger being up, they would say statistically using the SPSS software, it correlated so perfectly that you would say there's no correlation. In other words, what was happening with these hormones and with the hunger was exactly what you should expect with the food level. In other words, it wasn't like this one change in this hormone was really driving hunger. And this is a critical point, because after all three of these studies we've looked at together, and I tried to look at it as three different spokes of the same wheel, appetite has nothing to do with these hormones in a way that we can manipulate. You can't say, well, then I'll just eat this way and I'll fix it. If I just eat these kinds of carbs or this kind of thing, I can impact the hormone levels over here, increase this, decrease this, and that'll fix it. I'll never feel hungry again. Those things are all just perfectly commensurate to the amount of food you are consuming. I'm gonna talk about that under discussion. I know you guys are gonna come up with some really good questions that we can pick apart. But let me get us to kind of the part that correlates with last week. If you remember last week, weight regain between 6 and 24 months was about 13 pounds, which was moderate, but it was also correlated positively with that glucagon-like peptide. So people were hungrier, that glucagon-like peptide was higher. And so, because they had lost that weight, and remember the very premise of this study, they said, we know in literature, people who lose weight, they've gone through an active, intentional weight loss, they are hungrier at the end. That's why we have recidivism. That's why it's so difficult for people to come out of a dieting phase, whether they've lost 20 pounds, 50 pounds, 100 pounds, and keep it off. It's excruciatingly difficult because we have these biological drives to eat, to get our weight back up. And again, I don't want to anthropomorphize our bodies and say that our body is, quote, telling us to eat. It's just a response from being in that calorie deficit. And through these evolutionary mechanisms, your body is trying to get back to a positive energy balance. So the fact that this particular study group had a longer term intervention, even with a very low calorie diet, which was brutal, they then did a 4-week intervention to get them back up to maintenance. Then they took them up even higher as their resting metabolic rates recovered. Then they took them up to a true maintenance and monitored that for a full year. So these people had a true long-term intervention. And that is a game changer. That's critically important because somebody who just loses a bunch of weight and then they don't have that support, particularly the high accountability of a study, I think that's a huge deficit. I think people do better with this kind of intervention where there's long-term support. So hunger not being reported by most during that first, group last year because they were actually regaining some weight. They were eating upward. Their low ghrelin levels were promoting some extra eating, which they were doing. And so they reported or they did not report hunger while this new group did. So let me read this before you guys jump in and start reading it. I want to read this together. Putting all 3 research reviews side by side, the 3 that we've done the last 3 weeks, if you regain weight, fasting hunger won't be an issue. Like that first group, they reported hunger was an issue because they were actually gaining weight. But those postprandial feelings of emptiness, like we talked about in the first week, need to be addressed. We need to be able to say, this is the right size meal. I don't care how I feel, pushing away from the table. As soon as that gets fully digested and secreted into the small intestine, and I get those mechanical feelings of my hunger coming back, I'm not going to eat. Like that has to be addressed. But if weight is maintained, like in this study, you have to expect hunger. You have to understand hunger is normal. But also you should expect that, as this group did, when you're maintaining your weight and your body is used to that maintenance amount of food instead of a gaining amount, you'll also have the advantage of feeling extra fullness at the ends of those meals if you're managing your speed of consumption and so forth appropriately. So weight loss maintenance is indeed a matter of cognitively assessing the need, the blood sugar we talked about in the first study, and then managing hunger, just knowing it's always going to be there. And I want to say, let me read what these guys said. I'm going to read right from the quote. Our finding have some important practical implications. Patients with obesity who have lost, and let me get this pulled up a little bit, and maintain significant amounts of weight via dieting and benefit in terms of metabolic and overall health markers should expect a sustained increase in hunger feelings in the fasting state and be prepared for those feelings to occur. This increased drive to eat and fasting may impact food selection, eating rate, and total energy intake, despite increased postprandial fullness, and thus lead to a positive energy balance in the increased risk of weight gain. So after all three of these studies together, this is almost one of these moments that I feel like I'm going to let everybody down. We didn't find any secrets. It's just biology. If you want to be lean and healthy, there's a price. The price is you're going to be hungry between meals. You're going to feel great after a meal. You eat that meal. This morning, my first meal of the morning, you guys always talk about my food and what I eat. You get that oatmeal, the protein powder, the fruit. It's like, oh, I feel so good. That was like eating candy for breakfast. I feel so great. And then all of a sudden 3 or 4 hours go by and I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm hungry. I'm hungry. I'm hungry. I'm looking at the clock. I don't want to eat for another 30 minutes. Can I go 60 minutes? I'm hungry. I'm hungry. I'm hungry. Okay, it's time to eat. I go get my rice, my peas or my broccoli, my ground turkey breast or my ground beef and my yummy barbecue sauce. And I eat that. And it's like, oh, I feel so good now. I had this great, nice meal. Feel awesome. Feel great for 2 or 3 hours. And then guess what's going to happen? I'm going to get hungry. I'm going to get hungry. And I have to have a plan for that. I have to deal with that. And people who have an abundance of food and options as we do in the world today, remember, historians and anthropologists have said that this is the first time in human history that more people are dying from eating too much than eating too little. We're killing ourselves with overeating versus starving to death. It's a difficult thing for a biological organism to deal with. The fact that throughout our entire existence, these evolutionary drives have been to eat whatever we can when we can just to survive. And now all of a sudden in a 100-year span, we're dropped in a situation where we all have too much food. And we're expected to all of a sudden cognitively, emotionally override all of those physical impulses that are hormonally driven. And the conclusion of all of this research is deal with it. Like, it's going to be there. These hormones aren't going to change. They're always going to correlate exactly with overfeeding or underfeeding. And in a calorie deficit, you have the especially difficult task of being in that calorie deficit. And that's brutal. And your body's going to fight you all the way through. And then when you psychologically are at that finish line and you can now eat more, that's when everything in you physically wants to catch back up, for those months and weeks of calorie deficit. And that's why this kind of a longer term stair-stepping intervention must be there. It's absolutely critical. So let me unshare here, get you guys back up. Would love to hear your thoughts on this. I'll lead with just another personal thought in transition. Again, when I was dieting for contests and I would come off those contests, whether it was with a really high sense of control or not, those biological feelings were real. And I know people like Andrew Hughes and Kevin Brunacini here who have lost personally a substantial amount of body fat, each of them over 100 pounds, and have maintained that. Daniel DeSalvo has lost over 50 pounds in the last couple of years and has kept that off. I'm guessing none of you guys would want to go back. Like, the amount of work and the feelings it took to transition, like you guys successfully, especially Andrew and Kevin, you successfully hit that goal. And then more importantly, you've maintained that now for years. I'm just guessing, if I could say, would you like to do that again? Just to make sure you can do it, maybe show everybody, it can be done. Like, let's add 120, 140 pounds and roll through those steps again. I'm guessing you've stayed where you are for the reason that, no, that was painfully difficult. So even though you did it and it completely changed the life of you and probably generations of your family to come, there is a price that you paid. And even to this day, you pay it in the cognitive approach to managing your nutrition. You have to pay attention to those interoceptive cues, and you have to maintain a level of objectivity and assessment, even if it's very intuitive at this point, even if it's, you're not tracking macros and so forth, you still have this level of awareness. And I'm gonna pitch it over to you guys. I would love for all three of you to comment. But one last thing that I told a client this week who has lost, she has lost more than 100 pounds. She's on her way to losing another 50 or 60, and then she'll be at her goal. And so when we're chatting, sometimes there's this real curiosity, like, how do you do it? Like, Joe, since you don't, you're not at a place, you're just doing this for, your life now. It's not like you have an external goal driving you, but how can you not track macros? Dan, you asked this in the Nutrition Coaching Global Mastermind this week. What if we just want to track macros forever? What, do we have to be tied to that? Is that part of that self-accountability? And I said, no, I haven't tracked macros. Once in a while, I'll kind of do it for a few days or a week to calibrate myself, make sure I'm really true to what I think I'm eating. But other than that, I haven't tracked macros in about 15 years. But guess what? When I say I eat 2/3 of a cup of oatmeal in the morning, and I measure 1/4 of a cup of blueberries, and I measure a 1/2 tablespoon of flaxseed oil, and I measure a scoop of protein powder, guess what I'm doing? I'm tracking my freaking macros because I know what's in that food. I know exactly how many grams of carbs, protein, and fat are in there. So I don't have to see the numbers on paper. I don't have to put them in an app. I'm just self-regulating through the knowledge that I've already gained. I learned that language. I don't have to stay, in class learning that language. I've learned it once and now it's always there. I just have to stick to it. So, Andrew, Kevin, Dan, one of you guys, if you would, comment on just what that's like for you. Go ahead, Andrew, to be on the other side and the kind of price you pay now.
I think a quick way to put it, and I use this internally, but also when I talk to a client, I think it comes down to the fact that you have to accept from early on in the process that any tracking or understanding the macros, it's an educational process. And if you're doing it and you're doing it properly, you're constantly increasing your nutritional literacy. And that stuff can't be unseen. So to your exact point, if I want to eat a certain amount of protein across the course of the day, I know what needs to be in a certain number of meals. I don't have to track it, and I can feel confident that I know it's there because I have done it enough times that it's just ingrained. It's knowledge that I now have. And I think that's really what it boils down to for me personally, as well as other people that I've talked to, is you just get into a groove. And the longer you're in that groove, the deeper it gets and the easier it is to stay there.
And you had mentioned, Andrew, if I could keep you on for a second, over the holidays, you decided, I'm going to eat a little bit. I want to just relax and be with my family and indulge a little bit. And now it's like, okay, here's the few pounds I gained, and I'm just going to get back into that groove. Like there was no stress, no worry. You weren't biting your fingernails thinking, oh my gosh, what if I gained, will 5 pounds turn into 50? You trusted that you had that knowledge, and yet you still allowed yourself to relax.
Yeah, I can see how each year that passes since I had my initial weight loss, that feeling of, I wouldn't say necessarily that I had anxiety, but just that kind of uneasiness with the idea of putting anything back on, it just became less and less, just a duller and duller emotional reaction to the potential of gaining weight. And also, I understand very objectively the process that it takes to, if I wanted to get some body fat off, I understand what that is. And I know that it's not, it doesn't have to be that difficult. You don't have to make it that difficult. You can cater it to your own self. That's true for every person. So again, I think it just goes back to what you're saying, that kind of time is that key element. Like as time passes, the chemical reactions seem to dull, the emotional reactions seem to dull, and it just is easier and easier.
Yeah, well said. And just for everybody else's sake, after Andrew lost 135 pounds, he also got interested in just lifting weights more as a as a bodybuilder, whether he competes again or not. Like he loves to train, he's in the gym. So there's also that calorie expenditure and that ease of thought that, yeah, if I gain 10 or 15 pounds, maybe that's intentional with my training goals, and then I'll let that kind of fall back off a little bit. But it's not this, as you said, anxiety laden experience of, oh my gosh, if I gain any weight, I got to diet really hard. It's just, it's an easier process because those ripples are very low and far apart now.
I have to say this too. This goes right into what you're saying. I think, and I tell other people this all the time, that part of the sustainability is critically tied to a willingness to make physical activity part of your life. Because it also means that anytime that I gain weight, if I am giving a good effort in whatever that physical pursuit is, I actually know that I'm potentially getting a benefit, a significant benefit from it for my body composition as well. So it's just one more way to frame in your mind that you don't have to make it such a terrible, awful, bad thing.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. Thank you, Andrew. And before you jump in, Dan, Kevin, I know you speak a lot to our group, but just, the fact that you've also had a very similar experience, a question maybe a little bit differently asked than I would usually ask of you. Do you feel pressure? Like, do you feel like external pressure to stay lean? I know you're very seemingly relaxed with your food intake, and here's the amount of good baseline food, high quality food I have, and here's what I like to indulge with. But are you also, just now that you're this far into the process, just pretty chill and in that groove?
Yeah, without a doubt. I'd be lying to say that it's not an undertone to some degree, just for that credibility value of mine. But it also does piss me off when I'm getting groceries and people who either see what I'm wearing or who know me to begin with see, and they analyze my foods and they will criticize. And that just really triggers me quickly, just to, they should know me better than that, for one, but just to criticize regardless. Just, 10 years ago, that would have sent me into a downward spiral, just and just, I guess, self-consciousness. But I think there's that, it's more pressure from others how they perceive me and what I should be doing, more so than what I have of myself. But it's definitely pretty anticlimactic on my end. It's just the rite of passage from 15 years.
What about initially compared to now? Like, would you say that you were walking on thin ice back then and you feel kind of lucky you got out, or what did you do to just make sure you would get to this stage?
It was definitely a tiered process, like any big change like this. And I yo-yoed, so it's anytime I did regress was because of general holiday seasons and just losing the objectivity, for me at least. The training that comes and goes, I don't care about that, but the nutrition is far more motivating and impactful to me, for my brain. So to lose sight of the objectivity and the self-monitoring, that's when things would always crumble. And more, to look at it from a more philosophical perspective, anytime I focus too much on the result versus the process and the pursuits, and that's very, trite to say that because we all propagate that with clients, but anytime I lost sight of that, that's when I would just look for that quick fix, or just ultimately lose track of what was most important and view it from a sustainable perspective in holistic, graceful way. And once I finally, just with the help of my masters and seeing things contextually and analytically and just not absolutes, that helped to understand my perspective of it's going to take time. Stop taking that shortcut or thinking it is that simple, but stop thinking it's going to be from one thing that I'm missing, and just make it a process and focus on the big thing from a daily perspective. And those little changes over time is what adds up.
Yeah, and two things that I'll wrap up your segment with, if I can. you talked about the objectivity, and if you look at the National Weight Control Registry and all their research, of course, monitoring is a huge part of sustainable weight loss. Anybody who has ever maintained their weight loss, and I get on the scale every day. I mean, whether I'm actively trying to lose weight, maintain, or do anything else, if I'm at home, I have stepped on my scale every morning my entire life. It doesn't make my day great or bad. It actually does make it great. If it's going the direction I want, I feel good about it. But if it's a little high, or if it's not going where I want, it doesn't ruin my day. That's just another data point on the trend line. I'm staying objective, and that's what allows me to know how I need to change my food intake. There's not a huge emotional tie to it. It's just information. But one of the things that you said there, which at the end of your 1 year where you had lost your weight and then maybe had maintained that successfully for a year, and now 10, 12, 15 years later, the point of this study is your ghrelin levels don't change. They don't all of a sudden give you a break and say, oh, now that Kevin's made it this far down the road, we're gonna chill out and we're gonna make sure he never feels any hunger again. He won. No, you still feel the same hunger today as you did 10 years ago, as you did 15 years ago, based on your food intake level. And so that's, you've just simply learned, you and Andrew, to manage that appropriately, more objectively. And to answer your question, you put in the chat box, Stacy, the types of carbs, calorie intake, hunger, hormones, all that. What if you eat sugar, high glycemic foods versus low? And it doesn't matter that much. It's all about quantity first. If I have 20 grams of carbs from a sugary source or a starchy source or a fiber source, it's still the same amount of calories. That's going to affect your leptin, your ghrelin, your insulin, your glucagon levels about the same. And yes, of course, health values and vitamins, minerals, that kind of thing, and fiber matter. But at the same time, it's always quantity first. And so that's why you can have those little indulgences, and it's okay, So, that's not what you're asking. Okay, what are you asking, Stacy? You can unmute and just ask if you like. Do they impact cravings? Not really. I mean, again, if you're in a very controlled, again, cravings, depending on what you want to call a craving, it's not going to affect these hormones that drive hunger. Your palate, that's another area of study. Mouthfeel, palatability, palate, sensitivity. So yes, if you're eating sugar, you may want to keep eating. It's like, Lay's potato chips. I bet you can't eat just one because of the sodium. So yes, that definitely has an impact on just your almost hypothalamic, just drive for taste. So absolutely. Dan, were you going to jump in? I know I dragged you to this conversation a little bit.
Yeah, I just got something real quick. The big aha for me is to understand from an evolutionary point of view, when your stomach is empty, those first signals hundreds of years ago was, hey, you better start looking for food because it's going to take you a while to get it. Now, we don't have that challenge. You just turn around and grab it. So it made it so much easier for me. And just to put it in context, I'm still, a competitive bodybuilder. And, I got some pretty lofty goals that next year at 65, to win a world championship. So my motivation is on a daily basis still really strong because I've got that, 18-month goal ahead of me. So I admire, Dr. Kevin and Andrew because, they don't have that goal. So it's more of a day-to-day lifestyle. I want to, respect myself, my body, and my health. I think I've got it a little easier because of that, that bodybuilding goal. But the real key for me was to understand those first pangs are just an evolutionary control switch, which made it a lot easier to deal with that hunger and, still get it today. But I realized, hey, that doesn't mean that your blood sugar level is low and you need food. It just means that survival, is kicking in. With today's modern civilization, you don't need to eat. You really don't need it at that moment.
You reminded me of something. I wanted to make a post about this a few weeks ago and I forgot. I'm reading this classic book, Pulitzer Prize winning book by an African-American author who grew up, in the post emancipation days, but still when the Jim Crow South was, completely oppressive to blacks. So the name of his book is called Black Boy. And he's writing this memoir later on as an author about what it was like growing up, when he was 3 years old, 5 years old, 10 years old. And his descriptions of physical hunger, like what it's like to be woken up night after night, hour after hour, because you feel like you're dying. And as a little boy walking to school, to see your peripheral vision just going black because your blood sugar is getting so low. And, you even at that age, you just think, am I starving to death? And all your mom can do is give you like a glass of warm tea to try and fill up your stomach, because that's all you've got in the house. And so for what you're describing in terms of just those drives to eat, like that's what we contend with, even if we're not in straits that dire. Like you said, we can turn around and grab whatever we want out of the pantry, Dan. Still, those physical sensations are there, and that's what drives us. And that's why, it's a matter of totally being on guard. And like these researchers said in their discussion, this is not going to go away. And so for somebody to be successful, you have to develop strategies to deal with just those daily meal planning, hunger cues. And as all three of you guys said, just not let it freak you out. It's just normal. I can interoceptively assess what's happening in my body. I'm good. I'm not dying. Plenty of food options. My next meal's in the fridge, just waiting for me. I can wait 30 minutes. And then, as Andrew said so perfectly, it just gets dollar and dollar and dollar, and you become just, more able cognitively to manage it. All right. Any other thoughts or questions? I just saw, some people coming on and off screen. Anything as we maybe close out this? I may surprise you guys with a part 4 next week, but I'll see if there's anything I think can add to the conversation, then I'll do that. But if not, we'll move on to another topic next week.
One really quick question.
Yes, sir.
Obviously, the research that you looked at and talked about today was an intervention that was a full year. And then I guess a full year after of monitoring. Have you seen in pairing research any correlation between time spent in a deficit, losing weight, et cetera, with the time that kind of the after effects seem to be an issue for people?
It's both of these particular studies. This week was a full year intervention, the study I looked at. Last week's was a full year, but then they did a second year of at least survey, so you can see how they were after that second year. Those are beastie studies, because most studies are like 6 or 8 weeks, especially if they're inpatient studies where you got to lock these people up. But what we've seen so far is that, kind of like this particular study, at the end of a month, resting metabolic rate has recovered. In a study we looked at last year, even after 30 or 35 women, also with very high BMIs, had lost an average of about 45 pounds, their resting metabolic rates fell 6% in the first 10 days of the diet. 5 months later, after losing 45 pounds, 10 days after coming back up to maintenance levels of food, their metabolic rates and their thyroid hormones came right back up that full 6% to a person. And so I think there are some lingering, and even if you look at this study where they said, ghrelin levels, at the 13-week mark, from 8 weeks of very low calorie dieting to a month of recovery, then the Y peptide, the YY peptide, that was also kind of suppressed, but then at the end of a year, that was perfectly back to normal. Those things like the ghrelin and insulin levels not going back to normal are because the normal was an obese normal. That's not normal. That's an inflated normal. So they very quickly stabilize at what a biologically healthy normal should be. But any of those other trailing effects, the research last week and this week showed it just didn't have no impact at all. And so I think truly, we're not looking at things like androgens. Like we don't know what their testosterone levels did, after 6 months or a year or anything like that. But I think all of these hunger-based and metabolic-based hormones just show that if you're really controlling your way out of the diet, a month is your span that's the most acute. Like that's the critical time. You do it for 2 months and 3 months, like that's just icing on the cake. And it's important, like you said, as Kevin said, year after year after year, it gets easier and easier. But I think most of that is psychological and habitual, social. So I think truly you got that critical window of a month exiting out of a diet. And if you want to say 6 or 8 weeks, if you really look at that metabolic building and reverse dieting type process, like definitely take your time and maybe call it 8 to 12 weeks. But, it's almost like being in ICU for a month is what the literature is really showing.